Sure. Hey, folks, I'd like to welcome you to the 14th session of Creator Workflows and Platform Academy. Today, we are going to be covering Flow Designer good practices. So as always, we've got our wonderful presenter, Lisa Hohenstein. We've got myself, Kieran McMorrow. I'm a product manager here at ServiceNow, and we have Adam Stout, who's a director of outbound product management. And without further ado, I will hand it over to Lisa to explain a little bit about our session today.
All right, thank you so much. Right, so my name is Lisa Hohenstein. I'm an outbound product manager for Creator Workflows. I've been working on the ServiceNow platform for almost 6 years, and I just had my 3-year anniversary at ServiceNow. I'm so glad to have you all here. Just before we dive into things, well, you know this one, but I'll mention it anyways. A wonderful safe harbor statement. There may be some forward-looking statements. Please don't make any purchasing decisions based on them. So today we're talking about Flow Designer good practices. And I know I promised you some specific use cases, but it turns out we actually have so much guidance to share with you. We had to split up our content into 2 or maybe even 3 sessions. So make sure to follow the Academy overview post on the community to be notified when we schedule the new sessions. Specifically the ones for Flow Designer. We'll have another session covering migration use cases and probably a third that will go into a deep dive around performance and debugging tips. So very, very valuable content there. In this session today, we'll still have a jam-packed agenda. So this session is filled to the brim with info and guidance. So I want you to get comfortable and also hold on tight. So please put your questions in the Q&A panel. We'll answer them as we go if it fits the topic or at the end of the session. So, and before we get into things, I want to ask you right off the bat the first poll. So I want to know, and we'll look at the results in a bit. I want to know how familiar are you already with Flow Designer and what have been your biggest objections so far? So for you or your organization, your company, your customers, what is keeping you from switching from workflow and orchestration over to Flow Designer and Integration Hub? So let's see those answers rolling in while I start giving you a brief overview of the Flow Designer history. So what happened? Flow Designer has been around for quite a while now. So it's been over 4 years now. I couldn't really believe it until I looked into things, but I believe we released it actually in Kingston. So way back then, it was more of an alternative really to business rules and maybe some alternative to business rules and also email actions reimagined. In London, then we went beyond orchestration with complex and dynamic integrations and catalog fulfillment. We also added reusable components. Then Madrid brought foreground or background execution to help Flow Designer become a real workflow alternative and for it to be iPaaS ready. Since New York, we've been expanding on Integration Hub to deliver enterprise-grade integrations. But we also added a run from API option. So we have a quite extensive Flow API by now and a lot more Flow configuration options. Then in Orlando, we brought action steps to easily parse and use complex data. So for example, the XML parser or JSON parser, which are super handy. And we also added dynamic flows and dynamic action inputs. And finally, transform functions. Then in Paris, we went further, we added run with roles. So before flows would only run in a system administrator context, but now we can actually determine which roles it should be running in, which is a super awesome security feature because a lot of flows run in the context of the user that is triggering the flow. So for example, somebody posting a work node or a comment on a task, but that person may not necessarily have permissions to write to a different record. So with run with roles, you can grant that role specifically only for that one execution or while it runs. We added more security features like content access filtering, more details on that later. We added decision table actions, which is super handy, especially with the new decision table builder. and some quality of life improvements like duplicate actions and subflows. Flow data definitions allow you to collect data at runtime. This is specifically used for process automation designer activities and make those interactive. Then the second to last was Quebec, and Quebec brought a lot of improvements on the citizen developer side. We had a UI redesign to make the flow designer a lot more intuitive. We brought flow variables, a feature that was asked for a very long time because people were missing the scratch pad. Flow Designer also integrates natively with App Engine Studio, and in that context allows for flow templates. And there's also a new UI to set feature access definitions. Late last year, we had a Rome release, which brought a bunch of functions around error handling. So we brought action and flow error handling. We made some improvements to flow performance, and you are now able to set your logging levels to your need. And also a bunch more new transform functions, because those are always awesome. We have 10 out of 12 that have been using Flow Designer, at least for some use cases, which is a good number. But I really hope I can encourage you to use it more after this session or with this session. And then what have been your biggest objections? We see features, usability, performance. So security is not as much an objection, but I can see that there's something in chat too. So Brian posted, it was error handling. Yeah. So error handling is something that should be solved with Rome and moreover also with San Diego. So I hope that objection will be out of the way soon. So San Diego, what happened in San Diego? We brought more options for error handling with a try-catch error logic. So that is a really great improvement on this side. But let's start from the left. So when it comes to usability and adoption, the San Diego release is probably our biggest update yet. We hope that flow diagramming is the UI enhancement that can sway most people who have been hesitant to make the switch. So flow diagramming will allow you to see the paths a flow can take and the connections between the different elements. So specifically for your nested if then else constructs, or doing stuff in parallel, finding out when a branch will end or not. It's always good to see that, and it will be easier to see that with flow diagramming. It's not full-fledged yet. It's the first release of flow diagramming. So I just want to point out right here is we're, of course, going to be extending the scope of what is supported by flow diagramming. So don't worry about that. And then the second part is saving flows as templates. Right now, you can start and enable this feature on your instance to save a flow as template. And I will have some more details on that later. So those are really awesome. We have some more smaller enhancements like managing feature access to the flow error handler, more transform functions. You can now use new date and time, simple math, string and utilities transform functions. And then one thing that has also been changed that maybe people have not seen yet, when you look at the trigger record data pills, there's a run start date time data pill, and it now stores the flow start date in local time. And we have renamed the run start time data pill to run start time UTC, so that you will always have the universal time data pill available to you as well. So that is a minor change, but important to know, I think.
I think it's a great addition.
Yes. So I've seen your objections to Flow Designer so far, and I want to give you some arguments for migrating. And personally, my first is just embrace it. Like that is my greatest recommendation that I can make is Flow Designer is here to stay. So you might as well embrace the journey towards becoming an advocate for Flow Designer. I know I am. I love to use Flow Designer and use it whenever I can. And the more you use it, you'll become more comfortable with its features. And with that, it'll also be more powerful than you may imagine right now. So that out of the way, we'll start with an overview of our main arguments for Flow Designer and have some more detail on each of those points in the following slide. So first of all, and that's really important, workflow is not being removed or retired anytime soon. This is like safe harbor applies, but as you can see in your platform, in your instance, I mean, execution plans are still there, right? But most importantly, a workflow has entered a maintenance state. And that means we're no longer actively developing new features for workflow or orchestration, and all new innovation is being poured into Flow Designer. That's really the main reason for you to get started switching. And I'll walk you through some more reasons. Flow Designer has better performance across the board. It is faster, it is more reliable. It incurs much less tech debt than scripting, and therefore really lightens your load when upgrading your instance. So using Flow Designer and reusable flow actions will help you keep your upgrades safer, because you're not reliant on something being changed on you that will make your scripts not work anymore, or you don't have to hunt down the person who wrote the script 3 years ago, who may have left the company. So that is also part of an argument for reusability and usability. So creating subflows and flow actions for you to reuse them in other contexts, and also create contained units of logic that are easier to understand and maintain, and more easily discoverable. Just imagine if you're a new onboarding developer, you don't know which kind of functions may be hidden in that random script include util XYZ that has been created 5 years ago. Maybe that has the functionality you need, or it doesn't. But if you go into Flow Designer and open the available actions, you can browse them, you can search them, you can discover what's already there. And if your company has a good strategy in naming those scopes and naming the actions, you will probably find what you need and reuse it. So looking at the Flow Designer layout, especially with flow diagramming, that will make it easier to understand what a given flow does. And it is much easier and faster than it would be with scripts. And that goes for all kinds of developers. So that's not just for citizen developers. I mean, experienced developers will find it easier to understand what a flow does as well with just a glance. Speaking about low-code developers, Flow Designer is a lot more accessible to low-code developers. And there are guardrails that you can establish to make sure they only use the features that they are supposed to use. So security features and access limitations allow you to invite citizen developers into creating business logic. And establishing those guardrails helps so they don't accidentally delete data or update some records that they shouldn't. And this also helps building trust between the pro and the low coders. And lastly, and most importantly, Flow Designer and Integration Hub have reached and exceeded the functionality, if not before, then at the latest around the Quebec release. So we really think that by now there shouldn't be anything that you can't do with Flow Designer, except for 1 or 2 very minor things, and those have been decided on purpose. So one good example for that is rollback. The main reason why our engineers decided to not have a rollback function in Flow Designer is that it almost always led to problems for our customers. So imagine you have some business rule or a workflow that changes maybe 5 records, but changing one of those 5 records changed 3 other records. How far would you go in that rollback? How many rules do you need to dial back when you unroll a change? So because those things usually led to more problems than was helpful, they decided to not build this functionality into Flow Designer. And as always, if there are things that you are still missing in Flow Designer, there's a lot of functions that you can create yourself with custom actions. Or if there are logic portions that you are missing, there's always the idea portal on the community. So feel free to post your ideas there. Look around what has been posted already, upvote, because the more votes those things get, the more likely it is they get implemented and are visible to our developers and inbound and product owners. Then performance. So what is it about Flow Designer and performance? One of the reasons it's better and more performant is that it is running multi-threaded, as opposed to, for example, single-threaded business rules. That's one of the reasons why it's faster. The second reason is in foreground and background execution, workflow would only run single threaded in the foreground. So whenever a workflow would be created and you wanted it to be put in the background so that the customer or the user would be able to use their interface and continue their work, they would add a timer as a first step to push the workflow into the background. So that workaround isn't necessary for Flow Designer, because you can define that on the trigger level. You can decide on the trigger level, or when calling it from the API, decide on whether it should run in the fore or in the background. The third point that I was told by our engineers is that Flow Designer actions actually stay on the Java layer. So they don't call JavaScript, and therefore the execution will also be faster. And then lastly, something that I mentioned before already, it reduces upgrade costs because you will replace complex custom scripts with upgrade safe platform logic. And this way you will also lose less knowledge when your developers leave the team or the company, and you reduce your tech debt. So usability, reusability. Flows, I mentioned that already, are easier to read than long scripts. So you don't need to have any JavaScript knowledge to use existing subflows, flow logic, or flow actions. Flow diagramming will make this even easier. So being able to better understand where the flow will move after exiting an if or a try logic block. And you can instantly understand conditions, branches, and decisions, because it will actually label the different paths, like which decision has been taken here. So if you have an if, it'll label the different paths true or false, so you know which way is it going to go. So the single IDE for configuration and runtime information makes it easier to not just create, but also operate and troubleshoot business logic from a single interface. So when you're creating your flows, you have the test button right there. You can check out the execution logs, and you can also check out the connection dashboard to decide on which connections you need to configure. So when you're already using Flow Designer, it makes it much easier to get started with Process Automation Designer if that is interesting to you, because Process Automation Designer allows you to create more complex processes, which can then include multiple phases, cross-departmental information transfer, and most of all, Playbook Experience will bring processes to the forefront of agent work. So guiding your users through a process, making it transparent where in the process they are, where they stand, which steps to take next to proceed in the process is super valuable. So I highly encourage you, if you have dabbled with Flow Designer already, check out Process Automation Designer as well. And then shifting gears into accelerating and enabling citizen developers is the new option to save flows as template for repeated use in different contexts. So imagine creating a template for service catalog fulfillment, for example, that can be applied and adjusted again and again to meet any catalog requirement. The good thing about promoting process automation here is that your SMEs, your subject matter experts, your experienced developers can create reusable flow actions, subflows, and also flow templates that the process owners and low-code devs, citizen developers can then use and reuse. More usability. It was so much I had to make this 2 slides. So I've mentioned flow variables before. They're not specifically an advantage over workflow, but because that already had Scratchpad, but it's still an advantage over earlier Flow Designer versions, and maybe also scripting, because you can see the runtime variables in their own section of the data panel. So if you look at the data panel on the right of your Flow Designer, you can see all of your flow variables in the top, and you know they exist in this context. And then you can more easily find where they are used and how they're used, as opposed to hunting them down on the workflow editor pane or in a long script. Flows and flow actions I believe since the Rome or Quebec release can be natively called from Virtual Agent Designer. So this allows for easy automation of customer or employee requests directly from conversational interface. Imagine having a conversation, a virtual agent topic that automatically triggers an integration or updating some records, sending a notification without having to do that manually in virtual agent. But you can use and reuse existing logic and flows for that. Third part on the first row is reusing data streams. So once you have data stream actions created for third-party integrations, getting data from other systems like maybe your HR system of record or your ERP system of record, you can reuse those data stream actions as data sources for your imports, for your data imports. And you don't have to implement the same integration multiple times. And what's also very useful is the Integration Hub import product for robust low code and modern data mapping. So no more need to manually assign values and map them. You can use a modern interface for that now too. It supports data mapping for data streams in Rome releases, in the Rome release, and imports from XLS with the San Diego release. So that's a new feature. You can now also import from XLS, which is also integrated into App Engine Studio. On the error handling side, I've mentioned before, try-catch functionality is a very new one. So we can now allow you to try a certain logic code block or logic block, a sequence of actions, and then decide what happens if one of those steps fail. So if you have tried this a certain number of times, maybe 3, 4, 5 times or whatever, what should happen? How should the flow proceed then? And then also handling flow and action step failures with regular error handling that was introduced last release, and you can decide how to proceed. It may be useful sometimes to decide that you actually want to suppress an error. So if you have an action, you just want it to proceed, or you don't want to surface an error from a subflow up to a flow, and that can be done. Can also make use of the retry and notification capabilities here. I've already mentioned the connection dashboard. Using credential templates helps you set up connections and credentials easily. And one of the baseline functionalities that has been around for, I don't know, for years is the connection aliases. And that is fully supported by Flow Designer and Integration Hub. So you can make sure that you can have different credentials in each of your instances. So you may have a different path, a different set of credentials for your test environment or your dev environment than you would have for your product environment. And then, of course, just to give a shout out to Integration Hub, when thinking about integrations with other ServiceNow instances or third-party systems, always look at the ever-growing number of baseline spokes. We have over 175 by now with thousands of provided spoke actions. So check those out before you start your own implementation. And this will save you literally hundreds of hours of implementation times. It will make your upgrades safer. And you also don't have to worry about changes to remote API configuration. So if the remote systems have a new version or whatever, that's what we take care of if you use our baseline spokes. All right.
I was going to say that's one of the things too, is that I think a lot of people had exposure early on and maybe didn't really see the full feature set. But as the product matures, there's so much that's been added and so many fundamental changes because all of ServiceNow is really behind this functionality and the way that we're working, and that's why I'm glad we have sessions like this to really get it out into the community and maybe have people give it a second chance.
Absolutely. I know I was frustrated with Flow Designer the first 2-3 releases because things just wouldn't work the way I expected them. I was still a customer when it was first released and I wanted to use it, but I just couldn't in the beginning. But it has changed so much. But really, there have been so many great improvements in the past 4 years. It's not even the same product anymore.
Exactly. I mean, Eric mentioned earlier in the chat, he said, Flow Designer's philosophical change compared to workflow, and the process isn't one-to-one, but once you kind of embrace it, there's just so much more that we have to offer with it. Yes,
absolutely. And speaking of things to offer, flow diagramming, look at it. It's so pretty. So one note about flow diagramming. We found that at least in the San Diego EA release, so the patch 0 release, It doesn't activate automatically as it should. So you may, after upgrading, you may have to go into the plugin list, search for flow diagramming, and hit the update button. But once you do that, it should be there and it should be available. And it looks like this. You will have a toggle button in the top of your Flow Designer frame, and you can toggle back and forth between the two views. And an important note at this point, the linear flow view is not going away. So that will be fully supported and it will stay. So for some use cases, it may be easier to work your way from the top to the bottom. And in some cases, it will be easier to visualize the different paths you have. So you can take your pick and work back and forth. One note, though, as of San Diego, not all of the functions are supported. So we're working on expanding that over the next couple of releases. So for example, using flow stages will disable the flow diagramming function at the moment. And I think a couple of others aren't supported yet, like doing something in parallel, but we're working on expanding that, and more and more will be available with, of course, the end goal is that you can fully switch back and forth between both views whenever you need it. So just be careful. Don't be alarmed if you cannot use it. It may be that your flow has something that is not supported yet. Flow templates. I just added one small screenshot here. So for flow templates to work, you also have to install a plugin, which is called Flow Template Builder. Good examples for creating flow templates would be, as I mentioned before, service catalog fulfillment, maybe service level agreement flows or notifications, so that users don't have to set up the whole integration part or adding the webhook or something like that. So you can create templates for subflows. You can also see some of those in App Engine Studio already. At the moment, any customer can create flow templates. As of San Diego, they're only available for consumption in App Engine Studio. We are working to resolve this also over the next couple of releases, but I can't commit to a specific date right now. But we're working on that. So we want to make this usable for as many customers as possible. Looking at Decision Builder, we had a session on Decision Builder end of last year in December. So be sure to check that out, and also the Creator Toolbox with Julia Perlis on Decision Builder to find out how awesome it is. Decision Builder empowers your process owners and your subject matter experts to remove decisions from the flows. So actually removing the decision from the business logic helps to have them own the decisions. So maybe you want to have a specific assignment or send an email to a specific person or the group that will decide on an approval changes on the regular. So whenever there's a decision that would change frequently and you don't want to run it through the whole change process all the time, decision builders are your friend. And also one question I saw the other day was how to do a switch that you were able to do in workflow in Flow Designer, and decision tables is your answer. So either you create a complex if then else, if then construct, or you use a decision builder, use branches if the decision output will result in different steps. If it's the same step, or if it's, for example, in every time you would create a task, or in every decision you would send an email, but just the recipient changes or the assignment group changes or the short description changes, then you can skip the branches and just the next step that is being done can make use of the output of the decision and use that as a variable. All right, what else do we have? We can use and transform runtime data inline. So there are different components to this. Things that work really good together are, on the one hand, flow variables, and on the other hand, transform functions. So you can create, set, and use runtime variables. As I mentioned earlier, they're very prominent in the data pane, and then you can set them at runtime and reuse them. And the awesome thing here is you can, when you set the flow variable, you can apply transforms inline. So you can, I don't know, split a string into an array, or you can convert dates to string, and all kinds of math operations that we offer here. And if all that does not help, your last resort would be inline scripting, but we encourage you to try all the other options first, because if you use scripting, you will have to hunt that down once something changes. So be sure to use the low-code versions first.
And I think any of us developers who have had to bang our head against a wall trying to convert one data type to another definitely appreciate any of these transforms that kind of natively do it for us and do it the same way every time.
Yeah. There's fun in here as well, like sanitizing shell arguments or SQLs to make sure that some input doesn't frag your whole backend system. So always good to apply some sanitation right here. Keep your sanity. All right, we talked about access control and guardrails before. Delegated development and the collaboration feature, as it is called in App Engine Studio, but it's also, of course, available in your Dev Studio, is an important part of this. You can decide for any of your scoped apps who would be the editors, the owners for those apps, but you can decide on a very granular level which access you grant to those delegated developers. So it's not just that you have those predefined roles like editor and owner, but you can create your own labels. And you can also decide to give people access to decision tables or to flow designer or to process automation designer, and make sure that those people only have the permissions that they need when they create this logic. We've talked, I've mentioned access control. These are just some of the features that you can restrict to specific roles. The list is literally like 2 displays long. You can scroll quite a bit to find out all of the features in Flow Designer that you can decide on filtering. So you can say, for example, that a specific role doesn't have access to integrations, or they cannot set flow properties, or they cannot use flow variables, or they cannot publish a flow, or whatever. So if any of the functions that are in Flow Designer, you can restrict those if necessary. And same goes for access control in the form of content filtering. So this is the 3rd level that we offer. What happens here is you can not only filter functions like activating a flow, but you can also filter specific logic or specific actions. In that you can, for example, say this group of people, for example, HR citizen developers, when they create flows, they can only have access to HR process subflows or actions. You can say they may only use those spokes that are calling messaging apps, like sending a message to Teams, but they may not use the SAP spoke, for example, or the AD spokes. So with content filtering, you can even drill this down even further and make sure that people only have access to those functions and the spokes and the actions and the logic in Flow Designer that they need. So just to not overwhelm them.
Exactly. I think that's one of the things that's really nice is being able to actually tailor the development experience to kind of fit the persona that you need. And, it is overwhelming when there's so many options on the table. So if we can really make it friendlier, it's a lot easier to get people in there and start making functional benefits to their business units.
Yeah, I'll get to some migration guidelines. So what should you do? What should you consider when you're working your way from workflow editor to Flow Designer, and from orchestration to integration hub? So there's really fundamentally 2 approaches to migrating to a new tech stack. And the first being the traditional way, creating a huge migration project. And this would, of course, include several phases, like determining the code base that needs to be migrated, planning out tasks, assigning resources, and of course, tracking the migration project progress. The other approach is more agile. So the second approach would be migrate as you go. And I personally would encourage you to give this a shot. Whenever possible, adopt new baseline flows and flow actions that we give you when you upgrade your instance to new releases. Our product teams are working on replacing their previous implementations with new and improved flows all the time. Some of those examples are the ITSM change flows. They've now adopted decision tables, for example, for their decisions on whether something should go the path for emergency changes or not, or if it's an unplanned change. And also CSM has done a lot of work in the space of flow designer actions, and they're also heavily using playbooks and process automation design. When you migrate, try to set up development rules for your whole team. Say new requirements need to be done in Flow Designer unless it's absolutely not possible. But I think 99% of your work will probably be possible in Flow Designer. Involve other technology, but then only for those parts that cannot be done in Flow Designer, and connect those parts into your flow. Any change requests for existing logic should be taken as a chance to evaluate that part of your implementation. So converge those things to subflows or flow actions. To that end, make use of the call workflow flow logic. So you can connect workflows and Flow Designer and go back and forth. So you can incrementally replace your complex workflows and make those things available. Call the flows via Flow API from the workflows, and then connect everything that has been migrated already. Similarly, you can reuse existing script includes in custom actions to make them available for use in Flow Designer until you find time to migrate them into dedicated spokes. And then lastly, we encourage you to get together in groups if your organization size allows, of course. Find time to group code or huddle to talk through tougher nuts and get other developers' inputs on how to solve them. When working with citizen developers, some of our customers have started something like development office hours, where new developers could come and chat through any hurdles they face when creating their apps and business logic with experienced developers. If your org is small, you can still engage in our community on the ServiceNow developer Slack and in the community, and also maybe join dev meetups. Most of them are online at the moment, so it's a lot easier to join those meetups. So much for the general recommendation. Really, it's probably at the end of the day, it's going to be a combination of both. It's going to be larger projects for some things and smaller projects and incremental migration for other things. What are some migration use cases? So from workflow, you will move stuff like service catalog fulfillment, SLAs, SLA tracking or OLAs, and basically any task life cycle processes. If you have more complex processes, consider using Process Automation Designer as mentioned before. So you probably have one or two giant workflows somewhere that go, I don't know how many rounds and back and forth and so many phases and stages. Consider using a Process Automation Designer for those. And then you can use flows to replace all kinds of scripting, of course. So in order to reduce tech debt and improve upgradability, use scheduled flows to replace scheduled jobs. Use flows to replace after or async business rules. There's a tiny caveat here because flows run in the after context. You cannot use them for before business rules. However, for very small flows where you only need maybe one or two steps, you could theoretically trigger the small flows with the quick API from before business rule. So I'm not saying that's the most common case and you should do that all the time, but in some edge cases that may be really useful. More about the quick API will be mentioned in the next Flow Designer Academy session. I'll add the caveat really, I want to emphasize this, do not use this for large and complex flows. Do not run large flows from a before business rule because it will just block your user from continuing their work. This should really cover small use cases like getting some small amount of data from a data stream or maybe doing some quick calculations. And then you can create spokes. So any grouping of flow actions is called a spoke, whether that's integrations or just general functions that you want to use to house the functions that you would use, put in your utils script includes. So when you're migrating your script includes, create one app scope, give it a fitting image and a description so you can find it well in your list of actions in Flow Designer. And then for each of the functions in your script include, create a flow action. and just make it reusable, make it discoverable. So that would be, and if you want the low barrier of entry, of course, you can just create the spoke and then just call the existing script include from the flow action steps. That's totally a possibility. You don't necessarily have to replace it completely. And then speaking of integrations, moving our integrations from orchestration and scripted REST API into Integration Hub and Flow Designer may sound daunting, but make sure to check out the existing scopes because there are so many. There's also the option to replace scripted REST API with the relatively new inbound REST trigger. I think there's a Creator Toolbox session that covers how this works exactly, but it's super handy to have and to understand how to make data available to third-party systems. And then, as mentioned before, you can use data stream actions as data sources for import. The last part I want to mention here is outbound email. So we recommend to use the send notification action as much as possible because this helps you keep your outgoing notifications stay consistent. Make use of notification templates and keep all notification configuration in one place. If you don't have a notification, you can use the send email action, but be aware that ACL restrictions apply to this. So if you configured your flow to run as the user who initiates that, it may be that user doesn't have access to use the email function. So to test this, you can impersonate a typical email sender and then manually trigger the flow to find out if that. And lastly, any migration is a chance for change. So use this chance to try and have a good look at your processes. Try to simplify processes. Does your process really need this many notifications? Does it really need this many steps, or can you make it maybe shorter or have less loops or whatever, have less approvals? And if you reduce the complexity of your workflows, this will also accelerate the resolution of the tasks and the process. And then on the more complex side, I will say it again, consider Process Automation Designer. It's an awesome tool. If you're considering using it later, build subflows for logical parts of your process. Those can then easily be reused for Process Automation Designer activities. Break up large and complex workflows into smaller units. We will recommend that anyway for performance reasons. So don't have flows that exceed 25 or more actions. If you can, use subflows instead to break out that into those units. And then group activities by phases and lanes. Wow, that was a lot. And I have another poll around this and around what we just saw. So I want to know, which migration strategy have you considered using, or are you considering using going forward? Now that you heard about more different options and more different strategies, and then also looking at our upcoming sessions, which kinds of migration use cases are you most interested in? So which should we focus on, have concrete examples that we can show off in a demo? I would love to see your input on that.
I think when you mentioned, replacing script includes with some of these custom flow actions, I think that's a great thing that, I previously hadn't thought about, but it definitely, I think, is a very, very powerful thing. A lot of developers, specifically like myself, that was a huge thing, creating these massive, massive script includes, but having them in a kind of reusable visual format where you can go and actually start making tweaks without having to pull apart, this massive self-referential document. That's a big change, and I think if we can start driving that, and people in their organizations can start driving that, you have a lot of reusable code that's going to be really beneficial. So that's a great option that you pointed out.
And a lot less duplicates, really. You don't
Exactly.
You don't have to write the same solution 5 times, like getting a message or getting a system property can be just one flow action. You don't have to redo a script all of the time, or calculating some specific, some specific measurements, or stringing together fields in a specific way to meet requirements of a remote system. You can do that once and have it available for all of your developers.
Exactly.
All right, awesome. I see a lot of answers coming in. I'm hoping for one more maybe. We can see that, yes, most people are considering incremental migration, which is a really good idea, and then combine it with smaller projects. Things that I could see can be smaller projects are things like service catalog fulfillment. That can be a smaller project in a larger scale, and while doing incremental upgrades too. So every time you touch something, consider moving it to the new technology, but especially for any business area that has optimization potential or harmonization potential. And service catalog fulfillment is one of those areas where it is beneficial to have somewhat standardized fulfillment, maybe having similar phases for all catalog items, or at least all catalog items for a certain category, right? Those could be projects to make sure they have the same look and feel to the end user. Yeah, so I will share the results. People want to see service catalog fulfillment, scheduled flows, replacing script includes with custom spokes. Yeah, you said it. I think that is a really interesting part. All right, we're almost at the end of our time. I think this was my last slide. We have some Q&A. I can see that Andrew was already answering a question in chat, which seems to be a specific case. And then with that, before we head out, I have one last poll. We don't want to forget this one. We have our Academy feedback poll. I'd love for you to give us feedback on this session. I hope you like this session. I hope you found it informative and it makes you want to join us again, of course. And while you're clicking your way through these few questions, I want to give you a quick outlook over the next couple of Academy sessions. We will skip the next occurrence. So there's no Academy on March 3rd. I'm really sorry, but it just doesn't work out for us this time schedule-wise. But we will pick things up again in a month, so in 4 weeks, which would be March 17th. You've probably noticed today that we can finally talk about San Diego features. We're in early access phase of this release, and it's super exciting. Like every time, I think it's our best release yet, but every time I think it is actually true because we're surpassing ourselves every time. So San Diego will be generally available in March, but most of the release notes and updates are already available on the docs page. They're still being updated. There's still some changes being made. So keep an eye out for release notes that are important to you. And our awesome developer advocate team has also started creating awesome blog and live stream content about the San Diego release. If you want to catch up on all new features for Creator Workflows and the Now platform, there was the Tech Now episode 93. It's available on YouTube, but you can also join us over the next 2 or 3 academies, because we're going to be covering what's new in San Diego for Creator Workflows and especially Now platform, and we'll have a special focus on the next experience. So we're very much looking forward to having Amanda Jocelyn and Ashley Snyder joining us again as guest speakers. Since our last Next Experience session had such great success, we're really excited to have them back on our show. Yes.
I was going to say, I think we're not the only ones who are excited about San Diego. There's so much information and excitement in the community of people blogging about it, mentioning it, and really glad to have the tool in everybody's hands. And I'm really glad that there is such a thirst for it. So realizes that we're not the only ones who are very excited about this release and all the potential there is to it.
Yes, totally. So the next Academy sessions after those that are focusing on San Diego and the next experience will then be the deep dives into Flow Designer that I promised earlier. So we'll talk about specific migration use cases. We'll take your votes and weigh things accordingly. And we'll also provide you with tips and tricks to improve flow performance and how to debug when something goes wrong, which I think will be super interesting as well. All right. Thank you so much for your votes. Thank you for joining us for this Flow Designer session. We hope you really enjoyed it, just as we did. And I really hope you start using Flow Designer and advocate for it, because it's amazing. As always, we share this presentation on the community. I'll post the video once we have it on YouTube. We'll edit it and upload probably early next week. And you'll find a lot of more resources on how to get started, training and blogs and all good stuff in the appendix of this presentation. All right. Thank you so much. Thank you, Kiernan. Thank you, Andrew, Mark, and Adam. Thank you, everybody, for joining us, and see you soon.
Cheers.
Bye.